First story. The face of a seductive woman smiled at me from a billboard while I waited for the elevator on my floor in a high-rise building. Floor number 13. My thoughts were occupied with the meaningless moments of this day. Paperwork, traffic jams, and of course, this damn heat. Summer in the city could be pretty hellish. The elevator finally arrived. The doors opened and I stepped inside. The beginning of the journey was ordinary. The elevator descended slowly, but then, on one of the floors, it stopped abruptly. I felt my stomach drop. Is the elevator broken? I tried to press the staff call button, but it did not respond. Apparently, the signal here was practically non-existent. Suddenly, it was empty and quiet inside. I looked at my mobile phone. The signal had disappeared, and there was no connection with the outside world. Everything inside me began to shrink. When I tried to press the buttons for other floors, I noticed that they were all turned off. The elevator hung in some dark abyss, slowly swinging up and down. A silent calamity set in, and I began to feel real anxiety. Looking up, I saw a strange sign at the top of the elevator. It resembled a peculiar combination of geometric shapes, but it was impossible for me to recognize its meaning. My heart beat in unison with the throbbing headache. But the most frightening thing was that a shadow began to appear inside the elevator. She seemed to move, as if she was reaching out to me. I couldn't make out her outline, but she seemed alive, and something sinister. The elevator continued its incomprehensible journey in the dark, and I was locked inside, a virtual prisoner. My anxiety was growing, and I didn't know what to do. Where I am? Where is this gloomy elevator taking me? And what is this strange creature that creeps up on my fear? I couldn't move, couldn't press any buttons, couldn't even see the shadow approaching my position. My head was spinning with fear, and I felt truly powerless in the face of this unknown threat. And then, when the tension became unbearable, the elevator suddenly plummeted down, as if it had lost control. Something turned in my stomach, and I screamed in horror. The sound of the fall was deafening, and I felt the elevator speeding up, free-falling into some bottomless hell. When the stairs that remained at the very bottom of the elevator suddenly became illuminated, I saw that the threat that had been slowly approaching had disappeared. She disappeared into thin air as if she had never existed. The elevator hit something hard, and I fell to the floor. I felt great pain and a desire to get out of this trap. But when the elevator doors opened, I was faced with a completely unfamiliar corridor filled with a gloomy atmosphere. I ran out of the elevator and realized that I was in some strange and abandoned building. The walls were overgrown with mold, the ceiling was crumbling, and the air was heavy and saturated with something unknown. I understood that my nightmare was just beginning, and I had to find a way out of this place before it swallowed me completely. Second story. This day, which I will never forget, started as usual. I was a medical student and studied at the Faculty of Biology. We were engaged in research and experimentation, but none of us could have imagined that one experiment could get out of control and turn into a nightmare. My group of students and I were working on a project related to genetic mutations. Our goal was to create a new species of bacteria that could produce a protein that could be used for medical purposes. We ran a series of tests and modifications, and everything was going smoothly until we decided to do one last experiment. On this day, the laboratory was filled with nitrogen and strange electrical equipment. We closely followed the process, hoping for a successful result. But when we added the last element to the mix, something went wrong. The electrons began to sparkle, and a strange smell filled the air. We felt a terrible vibration and heard a dull, low sound that seemed to come from the very structure of the molecules. It was a sound that was unlike anything we had ever heard. Suddenly, the glass in our laboratory began to crack, and the walls seemed to glow with a blue light. Our machines and equipment caught fire and were damaged. We realized that something had gone wrong and tried to turn off the experiment, but it was too late. Our whole world has been turned upside down. A strange blue light blinded us, and we found ourselves inside something that defied logic. Our bodies began to mutate, changing shape and structure. We were in pain and felt like our essence had become something completely different. We have lost track of time and understanding of where we are. The experiment got out of control, and we became its victims. Several years have passed since then, but we have not been able to return to our world. We float into infinity, trapped in an interdimensional nightmare of our own making. Our mutations continued to evolve, and we became something completely unprecedented. Our bodies acquired supernatural abilities, but with each new ability came new suffering. We were no longer human, and our minds began to spin out of control. Some of us have acquired the ability to telekinesis, the ability to read minds and see the future. But with these abilities came terrible visions and painful hallucinations. We heard unknown voices, saw terrible dreams, and every day became an execution. Our world had neither time nor space. We found ourselves in different eras and places, observing events that no longer belonged to us. We began to wander in this endless hell, having lost meaning and purpose. However, our main pain was that we could no longer return to the reality from which we had broken away. We have been imprisoned in this interdimensional nightmare, and it seems that we are not destined to find a way to free ourselves. The experiment that began with our innocent research has turned into our dark prison. We have lost ourselves, we have lost hope, and now we are just entities floating in the bottomless night. We have become a lesson of caution for those who play with forces beyond human understanding. Third story. My story began with a dark move to a new house. This house was in a quiet and secluded area, and I thought that here I would find my peace and quiet. But what started as a dream quickly turned into a nightmare. My neighbors turned out to be strange from the very beginning. They lived next door, and I saw them several times, but never spoke to them. They spent all their time locked up, and it seemed to me that they were hiding something. At night, I often heard strange sounds from their house. It was something like a whisper and purr, as if they were whispering something to each other. I became scared, and I began to close the windows so as not to hear this whisper. One day, while passing by their house, I noticed that their windows were covered with black curtains, and a dim light was coming from under the door. Where could he be coming from? I began to feel that the neighbors were hiding something, and this was eroding my peace. Every day my suspicions only grew stronger. Once I accidentally met one of them on the street, and he looked at me as if he saw into my soul. His eyes were cold and devoid of any feeling. There was something wrong, and I felt a shiver running through my skin. Every night I heard more and more whispers and purrs, and it seemed to me that they were discussing me. I began to bolt the doors and windows, and always felt their invisible gaze on me. The longer I lived next to these neighbors, the more I realized that something sinister and incomprehensible was going on in their house. I decided to start an investigation and solve this mystery, but then I had no idea that my neighbors were capable of something much darker and more sinister. My investigative work began with the fact that I began to monitor my neighbors. He spent his nights hiding in the shade of the trees, trying to figure out what they were doing inside their house. My thirst for knowledge and fear intertwined, creating a dark attraction. After weeks of observation, I came to the conclusion that they were performing some strange rituals at night. Their yard was covered in strange symbols, and they were praying, making sounds that were unfamiliar to me. Their whispers grew louder, and it sounded like a plea. But to whom? And for what? Strange events began in our area. People began to go missing, and their families described it as if someone had kidnapped them. I began to suspect that the neighbors had something to do with these disappearances, and this was far beyond my investigative abilities. One day, while I was watching them, I heard their whispers, which became more and more lively and aggressive. They were rushing out of the house, screaming and screaming, and they had something metal in their hands. I realized that this was the moment when I had to step back and warn the authorities. But something made me stay. Neighbors carried a young man in their yard, tied with ropes and shackled in iron shackles. I realized that he was their next victim. They began to shout something, and their voices became distorted and ominous. The entities inside them were not human. They were something more sinister. My fear was immense, but I decided to do something that most people would never do. I recorded it on my phone, trying to document their ritual. But when they started saying something, my recording overloaded and the phone crashed. I realized that my life was hanging by a thread, and my neighbors were somehow more powerful and sinister than I had ever imagined. And I realized that my thirst for knowledge and desire to solve the mystery could lead to my own death. Fourth story. My collection of stuffed animals has always been my treasure. I have long been accustomed to the fact that they were always in their places, smiling sweetly with their fluffy faces. But one day something strange began. The evening was calm, and I lay down to relax on the sofa, surrounded by my childhood friends, soft toys. They have always been my support, and I felt that they were closer to me than anyone else. As soon as I closed my eyes, I heard a quiet, muffled conversation. It was a dialogue that could not be reality. My toys spoke. "Why do we always lie here and watch him leave for work? We could make his life a lot more fun," said one of my cubs. "Yes, but how? He doesn't notice us," answered the stuffed cat. "We could make sure he stays with us forever," suggested one of my dolls. My head was spinning with horror. I heard my toys talking about me, how they wanted to keep me here. The emotions of my plush friends were incredibly alive and scary. I opened my eyes, and my toys were in their places, as if nothing had happened. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't tell if it was just a nightmare or reality. Over the next few nights, I continued to hear dialogue from my toys. They were planning how they could make sure I never left this room. It was creepy, and I knew I had to find a way to stop them before they got the better of me. The fear of my soft friends was becoming unbearable. I didn't know how they could come to life and speak, but it was something that was beyond my understanding. I had to act quickly to solve this mystery and protect myself. I decided to record my toys' conversations to make sure I wasn't going crazy. Every night I left a hidden recording, and every time I heard their dark plans. They talked about how they could use their threads and strange magical abilities to keep me in this room forever. One of my cubs, named Teddy, seemed particularly persistent. He talked about how it would be better if I never saw the world outside this room, as if he was eager to keep me. I felt like my toys were up to something terrible, and my only hope was to find a way to break this curse. I spent many hours researching books about magic and mysticism, trying to understand how they could come to life. One day, when I became more knowledgeable in this area, I realized that the key to the solution lay in the special amulets that my toys had. These amulets contained their magical essence and were the source of their power. I decided to take a decisive step and began collecting amulets. My toys began to notice the disappearance of their amulets and became increasingly restless. My nights were filled with tension and anxiety, but I knew that my life depended on depriving them of this magical power. Fifth story. My story began the day I first saw a woman with a long neck. It happened in a small provincial town where everyone knew everyone. The story about her became one of the most mystical and strange that I have ever heard. The woman's name was Alice, and she was a new resident of the city. She was beautiful and mysterious. But what made her truly amazing was her neck. Her neck was unusually long. It seemed elongated and elegant, like that of a chipped figurine. People in the city began rumors and gossip about Alice. They said that her long neck was the result of some strange disease or curse, and that she was something supernatural. She always wore the hem of her dress hanging down, hiding her neck, but this only gave her even more mystery. I became one of those who wanted to know the truth. I approached Alice and asked permission to meet. She agreed, and our first conversation was short and unsatisfactory. She didn't tell me about her long neck, only that it was a family trait. But my interest did not disappear. I started following her and found out that she disappears for several hours every night. This was where her mysterious story got really weird. One day, I decided to follow her. Following the narrow streets of the city, I saw her enter a dark and abandoned building that looked like an old church. I followed her inside, and what I saw shocked me. The church turned out to be a temple of some ancient religion. In the center, there was an altar on which some kind of statue was displayed. Alice, standing in front of the altar, began to say strange prayers, and her neck began to expand and stretch even more. I was shocked by what was happening before my eyes. Alice seemed to be some kind of star being associated with this ancient religion. I realized that this woman and her long neck were hiding much more than met the eye. Several weeks have passed since I witnessed Alice's secret rituals in an abandoned church. My obsessive interest in her life and the mysterious long neck led me deeper into the darkness and mysticism of this story. The longer I watched Alice, the more mysteries opened up. She attended church every night, and there she met with a small group of people dressed in strange clothes. They performed rituals that seemed completely incomprehensible to me. One of these nights, I decided to come closer to the church and hide in the shadows in order to better observe what was happening. Alice and the rest of the ritual participants began to chant mysterious prayers in some ancient language, and their voices sounded like the murmur of ominous spirits. As the ritual continued, I saw Alice's long neck become even longer and begin to glow with a faint light. It was an incredible and terrible sight. I was scared, but my curiosity was stronger. Suddenly, the church was filled with a mystical light, and I felt that something invisible was next to me. It was an entity that seemed ancient and powerful. She began to speak words in a language unknown to me, and I felt my soul begin to tremble. Then I realized that my life was under threat. The mystical rites of Alice and her group were associated with something terrible and powerful, and my role in this story was unclear. I realized that I had to find a way to stop this mystical ritual and protect myself before it was too late. Sixth story. My story began when I decided to spend the night with friends searching for something scary on Google Maps. We downloaded the app and started wandering the streets looking for weird and creepy places. It all started as fun entertainment, but it soon took an unexpected turn. We looked through panoramic photos of different places around the world until we came across a strange place somewhere in a remote area. It was a gloomy street, strewn with dry leaves, and the sides were lined with old, abandoned houses. Apparently, it was an abandoned place. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but when we began to approach, something began to alarm me. One of the old houses had what appeared to be an inscription engraved on the door. We zoomed in and were horrified to realize that these were strange symbols and runes that looked like magic spells. At that moment, we did not pay much attention to it and continued to move along the street. But soon we saw that there was not a single living creature on this street. Everything was dead and quiet, and the houses seemed abandoned for decades. Suddenly, when we were walking for a long time in silence, we noticed some movement in the window of one of the houses. We were tempted to return, but our curiosity was stronger. We approached the window and looked inside. There was a woman there. Her eyes shone with an incomprehensible light, and she looked straight at us through the glass. We noticed that her hands were covered with amulets and talismans, and the room was full of candles and magical objects. Something about this woman was extremely strange and creepy. We felt that it was time for us to leave, but the woman, as if reading our thoughts, raised her hand and began to say something in an unknown language. Then something incredible happened. We stood in front of the window, suddenly paralyzed with fear. The woman continued to say mysterious words, and suddenly the candles in the room began to flicker like perfume, and smoke began to accumulate near the ceiling. We realized that we were in something that went beyond our understanding. The woman continued to cast spells, and instantly the magical symbols on the house lit up with a bright light. Our vision was obscured by darkness, and we found ourselves in some strange and mystical world. The landscape that surrounded us was absolutely unreal. Everything here was distorted, and the geometry of the environment seemed to defy the laws of physics. We noticed shadows moving among the trees and stones, as if something invisible was watching us. The horror that gripped us at that moment cannot be expressed in words. We were locked in this dark and mysterious world and did not know how to return. The woman who changed everything disappeared, and we were left abandoned among shadows and strange sounds. Now our main task was to try to solve this mystical riddle and find a way to return to the real world. We had to explore this dark landscape, unravel the mysteries of magic, and look for clues that would lead us back. But our hope was fragile and fear was our constant companion. Seventh story. I arrived in my friend's city with anticipation and interest. He told me at length about his small hometown, but one of the things that really surprised me was the ban on photography. He said that photography was prohibited in this city, but he could not explain why. As far as I knew, there was nothing illegal about taking photographs in public places. But still, when I reached the city and decided to take a couple of photos, I was warned that this would break the law. I was surprised and a little annoyed, but decided to find out why this was happening. Local residents were taciturn and avoided talking about this topic. My friend explained that there is a scary legend associated with taking photographs in the city. Like an evil eye, it was passed down from generation to generation, and the locals were afraid to even mention it. He told me that many years ago, when photography was just beginning to gain popularity, there lived a woman in this city who was the owner of the first photograph. She was a photographer and recorded a terrible incident on her camera. The photograph was mysterious and terrifying, and when it was shown to residents, many recognized themselves in it. What they saw shocked them to the core. This photo was somehow a reflection of their future, but only deadly and ominous. From that moment on, all photographs in the city were prohibited. It was believed that photographs could predict death and misfortune, and even make someone cursed. I didn't know how much to believe in it, but I felt a little uneasy. I decided to respect local traditions and not take photographs in this city. Suddenly, the terrible events of the past and the terrible legends of the city made me feel that refraining from photography was a small price to pay for peace and safety. The time spent in my friend's city became increasingly strange and terrifying. The ban on photography around me created the feeling that the whole city was under some kind of obsession. I felt like there was some dark secret out there somewhere. One day, while walking along the old streets of the city, I accidentally came across an old antique shop. Behind the display case were dozens of old photographs, and one of them showed a city that, apparently, looked the same as it does now. But that wasn't the only thing I noticed. Having accidentally climbed inside, I began to look at the photographs in search of something strange. Then I saw it, the same photograph that, as legend said, was the first in the city, the one who predicted death and troubles. I felt sick at the thought that she was here for sale. The shopkeeper noticed my interest in photography and, coming up to me, began to tell the story. It turned out that she knew a lot about what happened after this photo was taken. She said the woman who photographed her lost her family and disappeared soon after. Her own predictions were too accurate. I was shocked by this story and began asking questions about the photograph. The shopkeeper said it was sold to her at auction several years ago, and she ended up with many unusual items, including this photograph. I felt even more uneasy knowing that a photo that was banned in the city was right in front of me. But what surprised me most was that in the old shop I saw what looked like someone's shadow slowly moving around me and uttering something like a whisper. Every minute I felt that the ban on photography in my friend's city had much darker and mystical roots than I could have imagined. Eighth story. In recent months, I've become a regular on Reddit, spending endless hours exploring the forums and reading horror stories. One day, as usual, I was looking at a page with the title, "An unknown user sent me a cryptic message," and thought that this was another typical story of trolling or a joke. But what happened after radically changed my point of view. The headline caught the attention of many users. I started reading a post in which the author talked about how, one ordinary evening, he received a private message from someone named Unknown User 666. There was no text in the message, just an attached file. The author, being curious, downloaded the file and opened it. What he saw left him horrified. It was a video recorded in complete darkness. In the video, strange and measured breathing sounds were heard, as if someone was breathing heavily. Gradually, some outline began to loom in the darkness, and the author suddenly learned that this was his own room. The video continued, and the camera began to zoom in on his bed where he was sleeping. What horrified him was that his own figure was lying on the bed in a dead position. Mixed feelings of fear and bewilderment overwhelmed me. I started reading the comments under this post, and it turned out that many users were faced with a similar situation. It was as if someone or something was watching them, recording them in their own rooms while they slept. The author of the message decided to check his room after seeing the video. Everything was fine, but the fear remained. He wrote that the feeling that he was no longer alone in his own home did not leave him. I felt like my mind was starting to fail me. The story seemed too incredible to be true, but it created a fear that was all too real. I knew this was a story I had to deal with. What or someone is watching people in their own homes, leaking traces of this mystical activity? These questions haunted me, and I decided to investigate this strange incident from Reddit. Investigating the Reddit story has become an integral part of my life. I continued to follow the author's posts and read comments from other users who had encountered similar situations. Every day it seemed that the mystery was becoming more complex and mysterious. The author of the original post began posting updates, which soon led to a solution. It turned out that unknown user 666 not only sent him a video of his room, but also many other Reddit users. They got together and discovered that the videos were recorded in the same house, which was located in their city. While exploring this house, they encountered many mysteries and terrible finds. The house turned out to be a laboratory in which experiments were carried out with dreams and mysterious artifacts. The walls were covered with notes and symbols describing attempts to influence human dreams. But the most terrible thing was that in this house, there were records of how experiments were carried out on the residents of the city, plunging them into nightmares and controlling their dreams. Videos posted to Reddit users were evidence of these creepy experiments. All this became clear when a group of users discovered a room with records and documents. They found identification details of the people whose dreams were recorded, including their addresses. This turned out to be so shocking that the group decided to warn the rest of the city. Knowing that someone could interfere with your dreams and watch you, creating their own nightmares, was terrifying and unsettling. We tried to contact local authorities and warn about illegal experiments, but their reaction was unexpected and frightening. The next chapter of this story has moved into the real world, and many questions remain unanswered. We realized that we had to reveal all the mystical secrets associated with this house and those who owned it. But one thing was clear. The mysterious, unknown user 666 had become a link in the chain that connected dreams and reality, and our goal was to break this chain before it completely engulfed our city.